is about the extent to which all of the things around this kind of participation, or the extent to which they revolve around competition. That is, and I thought about this at sports, and I think about it sometimes in certain ways to talk about markets and consumption, about whether goods are competing for attention and something like that. So it was a word that seemed like it was animating something but wasn't. But I don't think you said it. And
not here. I may have said it in.
I'm not sure that you did. But one of the things that obviously becomes a hugely important ideological motif is competition. It's a way to think about merit and about what should win and so on. And so there's a question about whether voting is sort of really a model for other kinds of competition, or it draws from those, or what's the role of competition in your thinking about this? And so that's one question. The other one is about so one thing I read, and I don't remember if it's McGregor but sort of powerful analysis of the difference between voting up until probably 1896 or 1900 and after is in line with what you wrote about here in terms of sort of progressive politics being less participatory and pre-progressive politics. But the story there is it was big money that changes that sort of, becomes a barrier to entry, and so politics becomes more sort of civilized, and I was wondering where that fits in with the story here. That is, how much is sort of the decline of mass participation part of a story of concentration of economic power that happens from late in the century on.
Okay, so those are really different. I have a shorter answer maybe to the second one, though. So start with that, which is that I think concentration of power and significant financial barriers to entry actually enter earlier. I mean, they do change, but enter earlier, and that's actually a consistent story of the elimination of competition and the consolidation of power by corporations. But I think you can make the case that distinguishes the Gilded Age from the Civil War era parties as well. And part for that reason, I actually see lots of continuity here. I mean, that trend is a continuous trend rather than explaining the divide. One way to think about it is that lots of powerful moneyed interests decide after 1896 to invest in some, but not all, of these political reform causes. Whereas before 1896, they invested instead in just playing with the parties rather than fighting against the parties. That's a more complicated story, but I think that would be my short answer to like the sharp edge of the second question. The first question, I think the reason why I'm shying a little bit away from the word competition is exactly as you said, Roy, which is that we understand it comes a very loaded word, and the model of the ideologically loaded model of capitalist competition is about a large number of competitors, and the activity that interests me here is principally binary competition that involves two big parties. So it's not, what's distinctive to the second quarter of the 19th century is not just that a lot more white men get to vote, it's that the modern party system is formed. And much of what we think about voting in the modern world in the US context assumes a party system and assumes a two-party system and assumes winner-take-all elections. So the word combat, to me, in some ways, is more helpful than the word competition. But competition is involved, right? But combat maybe is a species of competition that sees a zero-sum game between two people rather than the sort of open-ended ideal of competition that's supposed to produce meritorious results or lower prices or help the cause. It's not competition. But I think that may be why I'm not trying to sweep it into the full larger category of things that would be competition. I think that might dilute some of the. I mean, it's analogous to lots of things if you call it competition in the broad sense. It's analogous to fewer things if you think about it mostly in terms of competitive combat of domination of winning and losing.
So just a little more per context, and at the same time, there's something about the. So what strikes me is that there may be lots of ways that competition gets some of its weight from things that are salient enough as combat, but also because of their repetitive or iterative structure, they have this sense of it's not only the one combat.
Correct.
It's going to happen over and over with many other players, and they're right. So it's like
right. I mean that's the structure of much. Let's just take sports for that. The structure of much spectator sports is that there is a larger system of competition among many. The game itself, right. In most cases, that were not like a track meet, but were and oddly, even in just keep it to 9, even the horse race. The horse race attracted significant spectatorship when it could be framed as a race between two horses rather than a race among many. So I do think even when there is competition in the business sense or in other senses, the presence in the heart of it of a one-on-one combat is necessary to the spectacle. Mm-hmm. And I would say that seems a significant feature of voting in the United States in the 19th century. There can be many parties and there can be many candidates for a nomination, but the act of voting draws some of its drama and spectacle and meaning from the possibility that there is some one-on-one. And in some ways, betting with somebody as opposed to like a betting pool, when there are more than two candidates, is one way of distilling the combat element of what might otherwise be a more open-ended combat. I don't want to suggest that that I think that multi-party competition creates a completely different set of associations. I'm just accounting for why a little bit prefer the model of combat to think about what we do when we use voting as a model or an instance of a larger form of identity projection or the other things that interest me here.
Marx responding to the text this way. I'll present them rather concise, and you can do with it what you want. So the first thing I'm wondering about the rhetorics and grammars that develop in addressing voters, convincing voters, exciting voters, animating voters, rousing voters. So in a way that becomes, and it would be interesting if it does become, a history, development of peculiar language of democracy, which I guess ultimately ends up with the soundbite, right? But that would take you farther ahead than you want, farther up to now than you want. But it's kind of a Habermasian question, but many of, Tocqueville's addresses, Selah ben Habib has interesting things to say about the language. What is the language of democracy? And writing I haven't written very many histories of development of a language of democracy. So that's the first point. Second point is this privatization of the ballot, which I remember experiencing on the kibbutz in the 80s. It's a very, very significant change in the nature of political action, influence and participation of the community. So my question would be, as the privatization of the ballot, private voting is, does that occur in parallel to the development of a liberal America? Privatized America. And along those lines, and there'll be my last point, is the stuff in the 19th Amendment, which you call the domestication of politics, the domestication of American masculinity. And by implication, you're telling a story where they democratize in order to in fact, de-democratize, in order to depoliticize politics and depoliticize democracy. Yeah, that's a big story, and that's an interesting. I look for Morgan's Inventing the People in your little bibliography, which I think is a great and very relevant.
It is relevant, yeah.
And it's about that, right?
Yeah, let me see which of these I should talk about. On the last point, that is definitely what I'm saying. It's also definitely not original to me. The assault, the progressive assault on the party system can be, and in fact has been seen as de-democratizing. I mean, there's an irony to it. I always bristle a little bit when people talk about, the progressive era came in and they transformed the end of the golden age of mass participation, and turnout was lower. Turnout was lower as a proportion of people eligible to vote, but enfranchising half the population meant that a lot more people were voting. So one needs to be careful when thinking about the progressive reform as de-democratizing. But it was meant to strip...
But did politics qualitatively change?
It totally did.
Not the quantitative question is less interesting.
Right.
And less significant.
And often they use the misleading quantitative measure as the proxy for the qualitative change, whereas the qualitative changes are really striking. What I am saying here goes a little bit against the grain. That's a hugely important story, which is that, and what Michael, I assume by the privatization means the construction of voting as a private conscientious act.
Right. A secret ballot.
Right. So privacy in the sense of solitude, right? So the self-contained conscientious subject doesn't talk about who he or now she is voting for, does so without the external influence, right? And just the fact that there were ballots, neutral ballots, League of Women Voters. That's a significant.
Well, no one
connection.
knows who you voted for unless you tell them.
Right.
And you don't have necessarily to tell them the right truth.
And the system is providing you a neutral ballot that lists all the candidates. I mean, there are all these things that we, Australian ballot, etc., that we recognize as reforms that were designed to take a power away from the parties and achieve the effects that Michael is alluding to, which is to take it out of the public sphere in some significant way.
Have you found that qualitative feature in this electoral imagination? Because it doesn't really come across just in case studies here.
Right. So I'm actually trying to show that despite that, right, there are lots of features of the earlier system that persist. So I don't want to minimize. In part because I think it's well established that we'll take the gender is the easiest thing to talk about. The construction of active voting as a sort of sober bourgeois activity makes voting appropriate for women, and connects it to and also a native-born Protestant woman becomes the good voter. The bad voter is the drunken Catholic or Jewish immigrant man, and so now politics is seen as genteel in all these ways. But if you focus less on just the brawling and the drinking, and think about also the wishing and the rooting and the avowing and the predicting, that stuff kind of persists. So that's what the story that Michael is talking about is a more important story in some ways than the one that I'm telling. But the one I'm telling is surprising given that other one. I don't have much to say about the sound bites and the language of it, other than to suggest that I do think that that's there from the beginning, and that one important mechanism in the development of that language of appeal of the voter and the grammar is the parade banner, which privileges the pithy expression, the ambiguous address. I mean, it's not really talking to voters, it's talking on behalf of voters usually. It's creating a we that then articulates the... so I think that is in place, and that's in place really from the second quarter of the 19th century on. I mean, this is something that Mary Ryan has written about quite a bit. The sort of outdoor assembly introduces lots of models of speech and action that shape U.S. electoral politics throughout the period that I'm talking about. There was another one. Was there a third thing? Okay.
The premise that it really doesn't matter, and if yes, how would you connect that with like what happened in the last 12 hours? With now there will be subpoena power, joint subpoena power.
No, the answer is no. I both personally and in fact in this work, I'm not saying that the outcome of elections doesn't matter. I happen to think that it matters even more than most historians usually assume. I just don't think that actually accounts for why historically why people have valued their votes. People have valued their votes even when they didn't think it mattered, in cases where I do think it mattered, but they may not have thought it mattered in the way that you and I are talking about. I think people often thought about their votes in ways that can't simply be explained by their instrumental goals to shape policy. And part of the reason just is that, in fact, people often felt very strongly when they didn't think there was a chance of winning or didn't think there was a chance of losing. So it's not about whether the election matters, it's whether your vote matters, right? I mean, I, until 5 years ago, was registered to vote in San Francisco, and I often voted in elections where if it went a different way, it would matter, but it was quite clearly not going to go a different way, and that couldn't account for why I was so insistent on proudly voting and standing in line and doing so. Eventually I stopped voting in San Francisco for that reason. Most people don't. Most people are today in the United States, and most people that I'm whose diaries I'm reading seem to be attached to voting for many reasons beyond the instrumental value of their vote to create the kinds of policy implications that interest you and me.
And one more question. I can't remember the exact quote. It was quoted a lot in the last few years in U.S. media. Something it doesn't matter who votes, but it's either who counts the votes or how the votes are counted. I think it's attributed to Lenin. Are you familiar with that quote?
I can't authenticate Lenin. You know, it's.
Is anyone familiar with
it's provenance, but certainly I see that on Twitter all the time.
I think it's Trump, actually, not Lenin.
Yeah, no, so this is the periods that I write about would be very familiar to observers of 21st century politics. Lots of insistence that your candidate is only going to lose if there's voter fraud. Your candidate's only going to lose if there's ballot box stuffing, if there's violence, etc. So yeah, people did think that it doesn't seem to have discouraged people from voting, though it actually may have discouraged some people from voting in Georgia yesterday. But there's no evidence that it discouraged people from voting in the 19th century.
And one more, of all the questions you raised, which you're thinking about 30 or 40 questions there, was one of the questions is what effect did the pandemic and mail-in ballots and the digitalization of voting how does that affect consciousness?
I don't have any professional judgments about that because I haven't really.
No, but is that one of the questions that's in your sphere of?
I would say that's probably beyond my expertise, but not beyond my interest. I share your curiosity about those things, but I don't think I have anything to add to the conversation.
The nature of representation. And, you know, she had lots of categories of representation, but the fundamental question was, what is the degree to which, when one votes for a representative, one is voting for that representative to instantiate one's beliefs, and what is the degree to which we understand we're voting for somebody as a person who exercises good judgment and discernment, and that the autonomy of that person to make judgments that we might not even have envisioned is what we're voting for. So I'm wondering the degree to which those different conceptions of what people are doing, what they're voting for in their the different conceptions of representation affect what counts as a kind of expressive element of one's voting otherwise.
Yeah, so I have an early answer to that, which is if those are the options, the answer is clearly the first, right? To the extent that people got invested in voting in the periods that I'm writing about for a representative, they were much more interested in. They were less interested in granting that individual autonomy, much more interested in imagining that person as somehow their avatar or their. But I don't actually think that most of the people whose diaries I'm reading are people whom I read about in the very large secondary literature on the subject thought themselves as voting for a person at all. I think they really did see themselves voting for a party, and that's not a novel observation. So maybe if I do more research, I'll poke holes in that assumption, but in the 1840s, the 1860s, 1880s, which are the periods I've been reading about most lately, identification with team is much stronger than identification with player.
And did that...
And that doesn't matter for what, if it's...
For what office?
Local office or...
Correct. I mean, you know, when it comes to the presidency, it gets articulated in ways that focus on personality, but no, it's still really this is the guy who is the champion of our team. And
same thing with mayors and I mean it's at the local level too.
Except when the elections become in some way extra partisan. I often will read newspapers. People are talking angrily about the election, and I actually don't know who's running. I just know what the teams are, and even when the teams aren't formal parties, you know, like something going on. I've been doing some reading about Utah territorial elections there, just because they seemed interesting, and often you don't really know who the people are. So that's I'm still persuaded that this is politics was a team sport rather than an individual sport in 19th century America.
But this kind of ambient political activity that you're talking about, like what does it mean to vote? What does it mean to like gather with other people? Whether or not that would change depending on what you understood, what would count as ambient activity would change depending on what you understood the representative.
I mean, it should be understood the representative as like a trusted autonomous agent. Right. Like
I mean, part of in recent terms, our sense of what always struck me as striking about the Trump voters is they want somebody who knows as little and has as little expertise as they do, and that their relationship to the democratic process has to do with, a certain sense that Trump could be them. Whereas I have always thought, like, I would like there are things I don't know about decisions that have to be made, and I would like to vote for somebody who has expertise that I don't have. And I could imagine different kinds of ambient relations to the election process and the representative process, depending on.
Totally, I think that's very smart, and I agree it would. And I would say that in the period that I'm writing about it, it's all Trump. I mean, it's all. So one way to think about it historically is there are people who I think were real good models for the other. John Quincy Adams, let's take a guy, right? One-term president. The only person who's really elected without a majority of the Electoral College. His fundamental understanding of politics and representation is the other one, is the one that you and probably in some sense I also, right? Like I believe in expertise, and not only does he lose to Andrew Jackson and to the emerging party that Martin Van Buren conceives essentially
Steve Bannon?
Yeah. But Mark Van Buren is a very important person in the story because Martin Van Buren essentially celebrates an understanding of the role of a party in opposition to John Quincy Adams, and I think that has carried the day ever since, and that's been a compelling story to voters, which is, whether the person is a charismatic authoritarian or a beloved, sweet mascot, or even a non-entity, the society will be better off if we create teams and vote for teams and become part of the team and become one with the leader through the mechanism of the team, rather than John Quincy Adams infamously said that it's important for political leaders not to be palsied by the will of their constituents, right? That's something. So yeah, he thought that a representative is like a good lawyer. You go out and you do what's in the people's interest, not what you not be their avatar.
To imagine and conceive of themselves. I mean, because just mentioned this transition maybe from a more Republican with a lowercase r, right, society to a more individualistic society nearing the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Do we see that transformations here? And also, by virtue of participating in this mass ritual of voting, which you compare also to mass consumption or sporting events or anything, the implications for those who are disenfranchised, I'm wondering, does that incentivize them to want to also have the actual procedural vote, or is it possible that it does the other, right? That it discourages them somehow by, distracting or giving them just this cultural satisfaction without the actual power of voting. So I'm just.
Yeah. So on the first question, I'm sure there are transformations. Maybe they'll become. Maybe I'll be able to see them better over time. I am a little bit sort of perversely finding the opposite.
Really?
But maybe that's what the way I've constructed the subject, the differences are maybe less likely to become apparent. But I haven't yet felt like, that was my answer to Michael's question about privatization as well. There are huge changes, but the things that I'm looking at, I'm more struck by what doesn't change, at least over the century between the 1820s and 1920s. The other question I think is really interesting to me. No one likes to be formally excluded from voting in U.S. history because it's an insult as well as a civil disability, right? So when it's phrased that way, there's never been a struggle over franchise where the disenfranchised group says, you know what? But the case of women is interesting because there are lots of anti-suffrage female voices, both time in response to both significant suffrage movements and all the way in between. But one of the tensions in this in the anti-suffrage movement is between the two positions that your comments suggest. One is it's okay because we can do all kinds of things, right? We can make speeches and we can influence our husbands, and the other is we do not want to be part of this spectacle that really isn't about anything important other than just, the gathering as a team and ultimately the suffrage movement succeeds when the, I would say largely in response to immigration, when the stakes of having political parties beholden to male immigrant voters, the stakes seem so high that as distasteful as it is, it's worth producing that revolution. Another interesting test case for Yoav's question about the relationship between enfranchisement and this would be young people. So as I mentioned offhandedly in the thing that circulated, most people in the United States in most of the 19th century were disenfranchised because of age. Right? Just the demographics were such. So that's an interesting disenfranchised group, because that's a disenfranchised group that expects to be enfranchised if you narrow it to white male citizens. So they can't vote. They are often included. They do things like they get up and give speeches. They engage in mock elections in school. They perform their partisan loyalty and allegiance in various ways. But they do expect to vote. So one thing I've been looking for is I've been looking at a lot of diaries of what are called virgin voters. The first time that they and seeing how significant a transition that is. So they always write about it as a big deal in terms of coming of age. But it's been sort of mixed so far, and so I'm still waiting to see a trend as to whether they think, oh, and now my vote really matters, whereas before my expressed vote didn't, or whether they just feel like now I have a certain legitimacy. I mean, it's a little bit like people are not allowed to drink until a certain age, but they kind of do anyway. And then when they're finally legally allowed to, they often look back and say, well, it's just nice to be able to do this freely and openly and proudly, but I've kind of been doing it all along. Or some of them feel like, well, now this is a new era in my life. So I think that's an especially interesting test case for Yoav's question about whether the story that I'm telling shapes people's perception of the stakes of enfranchisement. Enfranchisement is the thing that people have written about most, because the right to vote is much more clearly a proxy for questions of political power, whereas actual voting is not always as reliable a proxy for that. Yeah?
Okay, I'd like to focus on one subset of non-voting and then voting Americans, and that's Black women, who are, I think even today, considered, right, the number one political actors, the most loyal and devoted, voting, but also far beyond voting, political actors in America. And I'm thinking about them after the passage of the 14th Amendment, when men begin to vote and they don't, when Black men get the vote and they don't. There's an essay which I remember as being good, though, I mean, who knows, I read it many years ago. It's the first essay in Jump In, Jim Crow, that collection by Glenda Gilmore, Jane Daly, I think.
But I don't remember who wrote the essay in question. Is that?
I don't know, can't remember. But it's the first. Anyway, so there's a really rich description there of Black women in the Reconstruction South being at the forefront of politics, though they had not won the right to vote. And so I'm wondering, are they simply another non-voting public entering American politics, though there's, a strong argument that slaves were fully immersed and involved in politics way before 1865. But, okay, let's say post-65. Are they entering what is, are they bringing something new? Are they innovating in some ways? How non-voting political actors behave and contribute? Are these behaviors that they are learning? How did they learn them? And then, are they introducing something that's specific to them, to that time and place, to the post-Civil War South, which is also a way to push you on working on an entire century in which so much changes in who votes and how voting is conducted, and whether there are a particular moment within that century in which something new happens in your story of non-voters who are an important story of voting.
Right. So I'm sure the answer is yes. And I actually have been looking for black women voters in the South, and actually you might be able to help me find some more of those diaries. So the answer is it has sort of has to be yes, because that is a very distinctive category of non-voter. The response to, I mean, there's a decision to be made, which is whether to enfranchise women as well, and the loudest opposition to enfranchising black men and not black women come from white women, not from black women. Black women in the South are in the position of being somewhat enfranchised, whereas white women in the North see themselves as being again disenfranchised, because now there is someone in their community, their household, their someone who shares their political interests, who's more likely to vote. So that is a distinctive category, and there are lots of distinctive categories of voters and of non-voters in this story. So I don't mean to suggest that I'm writing about all those categories of people as the same. I'm sort of interested actually in the variety and in the various strategies that people who do and don't vote use to make sense of their vote. So a in that sense, quasi-enfranchised black woman would be, and yet another one of my categories, of people who don't get to vote but nonetheless see themselves as participating in electoral politics. But you could also ask about that moment whether the entry of black men in large numbers into electoral politics in the South changes the nature and the meaning of voting in the short term, for sure, but so much so that it triggers this large backlash that continues to structure the politics, not only of enfranchisement, but the politics of election conduct today. I mean, we're talking about the day after Georgia. Everything from the Georgia runoff is an attempt to assert. To with a voter ID, of course, a lot is an attempt to assert continuity over a practice. So that, in some ways, marks the limits of these moments of rupture. So I mean, you're talking both about diversity and variety, which I'm totally on board with, and then you're also talking about rupture and change, and without denying that there are ruptures and changes. Again, I keep on being more struck by what doesn't change. Despite the wholesale transformation of the electorate, both formally and informally, despite structural changes in politics, not only of the franchises and the amendments, but the stuff that Michael's talking about as well. Voting is so different by 1930 from what it was in 1830. So I'm looking for the things that don't change, because I think those things which we often take for granted might actually help illuminate the phenomenon of modern voting.
So then that kind of takes me back to the question. So how are black women learning political behavior. You know, where did you get this from? If
Yeah, I mean,
these are learned behaviors, then how did this process happen?
Right, well, I mean, non-voters are always learning. I mean, people who are not voting because of age, not voting because of citizenship status, not voting because of racial exclusion, not voting, you know, because of residential issues. People are always learning about voting because people are always talking about voting in public conversations from which non-voters are not excluded.
No, just
so, yeah, so in that sense, that's how they totally do fit the story.
Right. No, exactly. So, exactly. I mean, they do fit your story in that sense really well. But it's also a story about emancipation, and it's a story that's very much in line with the work that slavery scholars are doing today about how slaves were involved in antebellum politics. So that's sort of.
But I'm curious, do you see that as a fundamentally different phenomenon from the enfranchisement of women in the 1920s? It would be sort of the same thing. I mean,
but I mean, I think yes and no, because I think there is, you know, it's a more interesting and in some ways more important story when it comes to Black women.
Totally.
2 years after emancipation,
right.
Than it is about, you know, a middle-class northern woman who's been consuming news and has been active in the public sphere, you know, since the age of 10.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, rooting really struck me. So when I was a little kid growing up in Maryland, we used to say, "I'm voting for the Orioles." And I don't know if this was just like a stupid little kid thing, or if it was a regionalism, or what. And then, you know, then when we grew up, we like learned like you don't say that. You say I'm rooting. And that was like a new word for us. But everyone used to say I'm voting for the Yankees, I'm voting for the Orioles, whatever it is. And I wonder if there's something like it wasn't just a mistake in some of the.
Right, this is the most gratifying.
What's stupid is it's the Orioles.
At the time, it was.
No, so I had what your name is?
David.
David. As well as sharing a name, with you, I have the exact same recollection, and in fact, the first talk I gave on the subject of rooting and voting, I begin with that anecdote. I begin with talking about how as a kid, you know, all my classmates would say, "Who are you voting for the Super Bowl?" And I would say, "What do you mean we don't?" And I point out, well, we actually, you know, we were as disenfranchised from presidential elections as we were from Super Bowl. So maybe a kid is especially unlikely to to dwell on the instrumental difference between rooting. When I said this, I could see my audience was like, "Oh, that's odd," and I began to think like, "Wait, is it just that I happen to grow up in a world where people always said that?" But it's not. I mean, I even as an adult in talking to a Parisian, though he was speaking English, said the same thing about a World Cup match a bunch of years ago. Asked me to go. No, so I do think that is a telling lexical slippage for two reasons. First of all, historically, do you think that spectator sports and partisan politics have a shared past, a shared vocabulary? The ways in which people talk about sports spectatorship and the ways that people talk about electoral participation are overlap for that reason, but also because I think fundamentally that is sort of there's a lot that those two activities have in common. In both cases, you have you have people who know that their preferences are wildly unlikely to determine the outcome of a contest, right? But they nonetheless feel very invested in the outcome. And they deepen their investments, or they hedge their investments in various ways. They do things like sports psychologists talk about berging and corfing. Berging means basking in reflected glory. Corfing is the opposite, cutting off reflected failure. So you know, you bask in the reflected glory by like emblazoning names on your chests of property, or wagering money, things like that. And then corfing, you disown the losing side you blame someone on the team for the loss. We're seeing a lot of this today in response to Georgia. Committing verbal or physical violence against counterparts on the other side. All these things that sports fans do are quite similar to what people do in political culture. So it's like a powerful, empowering state of mind that underlies all these like displays of allegiance, all these sort of emotional hedges that people engage in. So psychologically as well as historically, I do think that they are fundamentally related activities, and that would be my guess as to why you and I grew up.
And of course,
hearing
economists also, I mean, like my economist colleagues in law school, will basically say, well, wagering and voting also are very similar. Like, it's hard to distinguish, right? If you wager on the outcome, it's not really, it's a form of vote, of preference, really preference.
Well, so if you see voting in expressive terms, then right, a wager, a cheer, a vote are all linked. Yeah, I mean, but you'd see why the economists might think of the wager as like the sort of bedrock model for it. I'm interested in the rooting as that, like that's the fundamental thing that you're doing in all those contexts, and then you do something else to mark your rooting, and it could just be a prediction, or it could just be wearing a button, or it could be punching someone.
One other small point. So in terms of the puzzle of why people are voting, it seems to me that it may be less of a puzzle if you don't start like in 1828 or wherever. If you go back to like, I don't know, 1688 or whatever. And so electoral politics in the U.S. and in Britain often do turn on one person's vote, right? Whether it's like the electoral college, which has to keep voting so they get someone, or it's like your very small constituency, with like 20 voters, and so it may take a long time for that to work itself out.
I mean, and that would be another answer to the question. Why do people think that their vote matter? It's an obsolete vestige of a time when it was statistically likely to matter. By comparing it to things that are not that have no instrumental power over the outcome, like a wager, a prediction, or an avowal of desire, I'm giving a different kind of answer, which is it may have originated in not only the historical era where statistically voting was more likely, but the fact that we do engage in votes where our vote does matter. In a family, or in your sorority, or on your corporate board, or even in the department of history, your vote is more statistically likely. So we have experiences with that, but instead I'm entertaining the theory that avowals of preference have like dynamics of their own that transgress the divide between when things matter and when things don't matter, or when we have power or we don't have power.
First of all, this is really fascinating. Thank you. And my question is in line with the two questions about the non-voters. So, what struck me as really fascinating and exhilarating, even in the text and in the talk, is all this celebratory feeling around voting, carnivalistic almost. However, as anyone who ever participated in Get Out to Vote knows, there are the people that for them voting is a chore, a drudgery, something that you don't really want to do, but you do for your family member, employer, something that, now, they might have not existed in the 19th century because of the enfranchisement.
They did.
They did, okay. So I was wondering about, their voices in the story, and especially in that story of this kind of celebratory and spectacular celebration of voting, which, as I think you emphasized in that kind of like, illuminated to me that in contrast to maybe discussions about the decline of populist vote, is in continuation somewhat, at least the celebrations around party,
right.
Party conventions, etc., etc. So yeah, so they might not. You say that they exist in the 19th century, so they also exist in the archives. I'm assuming.
They do.
But,
Yeah.
But do they exist in?
Well, so. All right. I have a couple ways of thinking about it. I mean, there is a something of a debate, though I'd say it's mostly been resolved in one direction, between historians who have let the celebrations in the 19th century stand for the larger practice, and those who've said, well, actually, you're only listening to the loud voices, and if you look at everyone else, they find politics distasteful, or they only think about it on election day. And that reaction makes sense, but then when people engage that argument, they found more and more evidence actually to support the original view. So yes, there are two kinds of people who abstain. They're the kind who don't really want to vote at all.
You're talking about when?
In the 19th century, but both in the antebellum period and in the Gilded Age.
And these people show up in the record.
Correct. So the best known Glenn Altshuler and Stuart Blumen wrote a book, the evidence for which is mostly taken from upstate New York, but showing all these middle class, native born Protestants who found politics distasteful and uninteresting.
Well, that's actually
And
really
voted out of a
interesting in
sense of
upstate New York because it's such a hotbed, right, of politics and activism.
It is,
who are the people who don't?
But their argument is there is
People
a
who won't vote Democrat.
there is a quiet majority of people who find politics just kind of gross, but they vote anyway.
They do vote out of a sense of duty to something, or to ward off the barbarians, or
yes, or just one or the other. Yeah, those are the two options, and the answer is both. The response to their book was a little bit like, there aren't as many of those people as you think. The fact that they only wrote with enthusiasm about it around election day doesn't mean that they weren't enthusiastic. So, I mean, I think there are limits to the significance of that group. It includes people who vote with purpose and conviction, but aren't obsessed with politics, and that's different from what we're talking about. And it includes people that we're talking about, people who don't really want to vote, and in fact may not vote. Yeah, and there are a lot of those people, and my approach to that phenomenon is to say that for them, the act of voting is still defined by all of these other sort of para-electoral activities, and that's in part what they're recoiling against. So to get back to the sports now, it's not the only thing I want to know this, but it's the easy one to talk about. Yeah, a lot of people don't like sports. A lot of people find the sports fan the epitome of all kinds of distasteful things, and will ostentatiously sometimes express complete lack of interest in the World Cup or whatever, or they'll go and then they won't even pay attention and they'll forget about it. So there are a lot of those people, but those people are also helpful if we were trying to do a sociology of the sports fan, figuring out what it means to be a sports fan. So those people are less likely to give me lots of evidence because most of their disinterest is expressed through acts of omission. I mean, you can look at people's diaries as I do and notice that there's a huge election going on in their state, and all they're talking about is who they saw at the opera last night. So there's a lot of that. Right. So it's hard. It's a little hard to sort of wrestle with that evidence, but I don't think that their lack of interest means that voting is any less resonant with the other things that I'm talking about. It just means that they find all of that kind of just like
right.
Yeah.
But that's why I think that the voice of this group is so interesting, because I think it helps your argument about this being some kind of a mass phenomenon, that whether you like it or not, whether you find tasteful the celebratory aspect of it, or whether you're passionate about it or not, you find yourself compelled to participate in it basically because of the social context.
Yeah.
And speaking about that, I mean, I'm assuming you know it, but as a sociologist, I must mention Paul Lazarsfeld's, and collaborators, researchers about voting in the 30s and 40s
Right,
that
the
found
20th
exactly the same kind of
Right.
like, it says something that people do because, you know, they do it in church and they talk about it, like, but they do it like, they shop soap, soap and shoes.
Right. I mean, I think that those findings, political historians usually see that more as evidence of the thing that that Michael was talking about, of the decline. But from my perspective, from my perspective, it's not actually sign of decline. There is sort of content. That's a helpful. I hadn't thought about the latter as well.
It's a continuity.
Yeah. Thanks.
So, first is regarding the role of third parties in your story. Are the moments of third party the most interesting and important part of the story, or the least important part of the story? Meaning, do they make salient something that's hidden when there's moment, the continuing of a two-party, or do they exhibit something that's weird and out of context?
Yeah. I would say they render visible helpful things in only one part of my story, which is when people talk about the utility of voting. So to the extent that one of my 4 inquiries is about how ordinary people thought about the utility of voting, third-party challenges bring that out, and that's great. For most of what I'm trying to do, they're not actually that helpful. Because they're not actually representative. That the story of, I think the story of U.S. politics in the 19th century is largely about the suppression and defeat of third parties. I mean, we think about the significant third parties, either significant in the sense of like the Republican Party that then becomes the second party, okay, or we think about the populists. But in both those cases, it's quickly swept into a two-party system. So historically, I don't think the third parties have been that important. And the model of voting that I'm working with here is much more at ease with voting as a binary choice.
So here comes the follow-up question regarding that, and that's the sport metaphor.
Yeah.
Because the moment when there's new teams, it might be exciting and you might switch to. That's an exciting moment in sports also.
It is
expansion teams,
right? It gets back to Roy's question, or my answer to Roy's question, which is, it's exciting to think of maybe their analogies in realms, in interpersonal realms that aren't about this at all. But it may be exciting to imagine another entity to express allegiance to, but the model of allegiance works best when you're going to be rooting for it to defeat one opponent. Even though there's a field of other... So a third party is different from a new sports team. A new sports team enters a league, but the games will still be played out in one-on-one contests. Whereas a third party turns the contest itself into something different. And so that's why third parties don't actually work so well for this.
Perhaps if you think of the entire iteration of election as one contest and not a series of a lot of contests, right? So there's a league in the meaning there's a lot of one-on-one contents in any specific jurisdiction, but when you look at the whole sum, it looks more like a league structure.
It may, though. I can't think of any time in U.S. political history where that works.
I'll flip the question to the third one, and that's regarding the competition versus combat and the role of monopolies in the imagination of and the cultural imagination and the race to be a monopoly. So in a way, being the party system is a race to be a monopoly, to have a monopoly for
a kind of monopoly.
Kind of monopoly for
it's a duopoly, right?
No, yeah. So it's duopoly, but in every condensation, and with having a monopoly for a certain.
Correct. It's the elimination of competition.
Right. And also race between in a duopoly. A lot of time, I'll take the railroad as an example. We always race to be the monopoly in the end. And so, and that moment, the question of combat versus competition kind of struggled the kind of what the metaphor and how the voters understood, and that regards not what's the actual model, but how they understood. Did they see themselves? Did they see the parties in a similar way as they saw monopoly?
I don't think so. I think anti-monopolist rhetoric could be used to help a third party gain some kind of make inroads in a second party, but the monopolistic company doesn't want there to be one powerful adversary, right? There wants to be nobody, and the political party does want there, ideally, to be many adversaries, because then that, right? They want to split. So from the perspective of the parties that the analogy I'm not sure holds, and the objection to monopolies that doesn't translate, I think, into people not wanting there to be binary combat between people. Yeah, I mean, I'll think more about that. I hadn't thought about it. But again, I think I said both. Sorry, your name is Alon. I think we're going to talk. But both Alon and Roy's questions are wondering whether the larger context for this, especially in the late 19th century, might be the kind of a political culture of competitive capitalism, and as opposed to what I'm sort of proposing, which is that the larger culture for it is all the other times when you're given two choices and you want to imagine that the outcome of that combat reflects upon you. So I hear that, and I'll think more about that.
All right, I think